Okay, this video is going to be on the McClellan-McLean house, also known as the Jenny Wade house, and this is going to be our first part. This house, which sits on Cemetery Hill, was in the thick of the fighting on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863 during the Battle of Gettysburg. It has between 150 and 200 damage holes all around the house. On June 26, 1863, Georgia McClellan gave birth to a baby boy, Lewis Kenneth McClellan. Her husband, John Lewis McClellan, was serving in the Union Army in the 165th Pennsylvania Volunteers. The child and the new mother laid here on a walnut frame bed in the parlor on the left side of the house, just beyond the red parlor door that you see there in front of us. The young couple, John Lewis and Georgia, were married just a year before, on April the 15th of 1862. Her sister, Mary Virginia Jenny Wade, and her mother, Mary Ann Philby Wade, left their residence on Breckenridge Street, just down the road here on Baltimore Street, to come here and help Georgia McClellan after the birth of her newborn son. This has been our first part here of the McClellan-McLean house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tour. By the evening of July 1st, 1863, Confederate troops under the command of General Robert Edward Lee had pushed Union troops back through the town of Gettysburg to a crest of a small civilian cemetery called Evergreen Cemetery. Confederate troops seized the town, setting up roadblocks and taking over different various homes, using them as sharpshooters positions as well as field hospitals. Some of the homes on Baltimore Street that were taken were the Sweeney House, which can be seen in the distance, as well as the John Rupp House, and then over in the distance would be the McCreary and Welty House. One small house, which was a two-family residence that sat here on Cemetery Hill, was inside the Union line, but also in no man's land. And that was this house that we're above now, the McClellan-McLean house. Inside of that house was a mother with her 5-day-old son and a visiting sister and mother. Through the night of the 1st and into the morning of the 2nd, wounded Union soldiers were all around this house here on Cemetery Hill. And a 20-year-old woman named Mary Virginia Wade, visiting and helping out her sister after the birth of her son, tended to the Union wounded, bringing them water from the well and also beginning to bake bread and biscuits. The inhabitants of this house had stayed, the McClellans, as well as the McLeans. Now, the McClellans stayed in the north side bottom level, and the McLeans stayed in the upper level of the southern side. This has been our next part of the McClellan-McLean house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tour. On the morning of July 2nd, 1863, skirmishing between Union and Confederate troops had begun. During a part in the action, a 10-pound Confederate parrot shell struck the McClellan-McLean house right in the center of our screen. It went right through the roof and then taking out part of the dividing wall that separated the two residences, which would be split right down where you see the chimney. It lodged itself in the upstairs room on the McLean side without exploding. Jenny fainted at that time, and at that time the McClellan family, who was living in the upper half of the house, went below into the basement after the close call. But the Wade and McClellan families facing Confederate forces continued to stay on the ground level where our camera is now. The hole that was made in the wall dividing the residence would later be enlarged to allow for an escape route of the McClellan family on July 3rd, the next day of 1863. This has been our next part of the McClellan-McLean house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tour. By 9 p.m. on July 2nd, 1863, Jenny had run out of flour. Union soldiers began coming to the door from Cemetery Hill, and they were begging her for food. Jenny and her mother at 9 p.m. began to make more yeast. And by the time they finished mixing up the yeast, it was 10 p.m. on the evening of July 2nd, 1863. On the morning of July 3rd, 1863, at 4:30 in the morning, the yeast that Jenny and her mother made had rose, and Jenny left the house with her brother Harry and headed out to go look for firewood for the bake oven. It is important to realize what was going on here on the morning of July 3rd, 1863. You have Cemetery Hill and the hillside in the distance with the Union Army. You have the Confederate Army about 2 blocks south of here in the town of Gettysburg, a small town of just 2,400 residents. And right in the center, between these two armies on this hillside, was this small house built in 1842. It sat on a U.S. skirmish line with a fire burning. So again, you can see why this house, sitting in the middle of two armies on the side of a hill in the very morning of July 3rd, 1863, was under fire. Now at 5 a.m., a soldier arrives at the door. He arrived at this very door here, the original 1842 door, and asked Jenny Wade, or Mary Virginia Wade, for food. And she was told to come back later. He was told to come back later for that food. Meanwhile, at 6:30 in the morning, the McClellan family sat here in the parlor for breakfast. On the morning of July 3rd, 1863, at 6:50 in the morning, Mary Virginia Wade sat in the parlor with her sister and newborn child. She begins to read aloud from the Holy Bible, Psalm 27 and 30. The Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Whom shall I be afraid? Now, with bullets from both Confederate and Union armies striking this house, and Georgia being terrified, clinging to her 5-day-old baby, she got a little bit spooked out about these things of whom shall I fear, and she asked Jenny to please stop her reading. Jenny would turn to her and say that if anyone was to be killed in this house today, she would hope it would be her, since Georgia had a child. This has been our next part here at the McClellan-McLean house, the house where Mary Virginia Wade, the only civilian during the Battle of Gettysburg, was killed on July 3rd, 1863, here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. Okay, in our next part of the McClellan and McLean house, I want to talk about the shot that killed Jenny Wade. Now, a lot of debate has been talked about of where the fatal shot came from that killed Jenny Wade. Now, I believe personally that it came from the John Rupp house, which stood on the site where you see this balcony today. Remember, the other portions of the house were built after the American Civil War and after the Battle of Gettysburg, but the foundation of the Rupp house is the original, and then the house was remodeled over that foundation a few years after the battle. And I believe that a Confederate soldier that was standing on the balcony, and again, the balcony went further up here toward Baltimore Street, and as we walk up Baltimore Street, you will see the Jenny Wade house today next to the Holiday Inn. So this is probably the closest house that has the right angle that would have fired the shot that killed Mary Virginia Wade on July 3rd of 1863. And the Jenny Wade house would be just behind where that telephone pole is today. So you can see a shot coming from this area, flying in this direction, and it would be the appropriate distance to hit Jenny Wade in the kitchen, which is just over here. Of course, the other houses that have been debated where the fatal shot may have been fired would have also been the house across the street there, the Solomon Welty house, which also the rear of it is the original. And then, of course, down the street, a distance, way in the distance, would have been the Sweeney home. This has been our next part of the McClellan-McLean house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. Okay, now the shot that killed Jenny Wade came from this direction and went through this door right here.
Sometimes they get stuck in my little steps out back, so I scoop them up and send them back on their merry way. Perfect timing. Anybody else hear that? Yeah, over there.
Now we are inside of the parlor of the the kitchen of the Jenny Wade house, and this is the very dough table that Jenny was killed standing behind. And of course, this is the parlor door with the bullet hole, the second door or the inside door that the bullet had penetrated. The dough table, she was standing in front of it when she was struck. And then you can see in this view both holes, the outer door as well as the parlor door, which was open for her for extra protection. Okay, we are now in the parlor of the McClellan home, and this is where Georgia McClellan and her 5-day-old infant son were in, just moments before the bullet fatally struck Mary Virginia Wade. It was also the room that Mary Virginia Wade had just exited after reading from the book of Psalms in the Holy Bible. This, of course, spooked out Georgia McClellan, and she asked Jenny to stop. Jenny then said, "If someone in this house is to be killed today, I hope it is me." And this is the walnut bed frame. Now, as we go through the path of the bullet, you will see here on the fireplace, the bullet hole in the fireplace, as well as in the frame of the walnut bed. And Georgia was with her infant son. The bullet struck the bed, then landed on the pillow that she was laying on with her son. They then picked up, along with a couple Union soldiers, Jenny's body, wrapped it in a blanket, and moved it up this very staircase up into the McClellan room upstairs, which was unoccupied at the time of the battle. So again, they came up these staircases here into this vacant room that was being used for storage. Now remember, Georgia had screamed after hearing Jenny had been killed, and they had to find a way to get the body outside without going through the McClellan side of the house. And if you remember, on July 2nd of 1863, a shell had passed through the roof of the house and hit a dividing wall, knocking a large hole in it. So Union soldiers at this point began to take more brick away from the hole that the 10-pound Parrott shell had already made. And they opened it up to the point where they could get the families through into the McLean side, and Jenny's body wrapped in a blanket. And that's exactly what they did. They carried her through this very hole that they had expanded into the McLean side of the house. And once they were at the McLean side of the house, all they needed to do was go down the stairs and then out the McLean side. Now this was the room here on the McLean side of the house that the shell had landed in. And so what they did, and there is where the shell had ended up, what they did was they carried Jenny over toward this window, which still, by the way, has the wavy glass on it, and then down this staircase into the McLean kitchen. Now this kitchen is on the opposite side of the McClellan kitchen in which Jenny was killed. And simply from here, they would take her body wrapped in a blanket outside the McLean house and down the cellar steps into the basement where we are now. And it was here in this basement that Jenny Wade was laid on a cot and covered with a blanket. Her family would keep a morning vigil from July 3rd in the afternoon until about 1 p.m. on July 4th of 1863, when they would receive a coffin from the nearby Catherine Garlock cabinet and coffin making shop. There is a painting depicted on the wall entitled "Through a Mother's Eyes." Since the mother is the only one not in the painting, this is what the mother was seeing that day. She also would go back upstairs and make 15 more loaves of bread in the kitchen in which her daughter was killed. We're going to go ahead to the Garlock home in a minute. Jenny would be carried up the cellar steps. Okay, on our next part of the McClellan-McLean house, we are standing here at 321 and 323 Baltimore Street. And this was the Catherine Garlock house. Now, Catherine Garlock lived here during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. The house was abandoned by the family just before the battle. However, Catherine stayed behind, and as you've seen on a former video, she actually housed a Union general behind the house in a woodshed. Now, the left part of the house, which is 323, was the residence. The right side was a cabinetry and coffin making shop. And it was here on July 4th, 1863, that a coffin that was intended for a Confederate general was taken from this house down Baltimore Street to the McClellan and McLean house, and it was placed on the south side of the house. The body of Jenny Wade was brought up from the cellar, placed in the coffin that came from the Garlock coffin making shop, and then was buried in the rose garden there at the McClellan and McLean house. This has been our next part of the McClellan-McLean house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tour. Okay, we are on the south side of the McClellan-McLean house. In our last video we shot at the Catherine Garlock home. We mentioned the casket that arrived here on July 4th of 1863. It was brought here to this side of the house. Jenny's body was taken from the cellar and brought out here and buried in the rose garden, which was right here outside the cellar door. And she would remain here until November of 1865, when she would then be disinterred from the spot and taken to the German Reformed Church Cemetery on Stratton Street. This has been our next part of the McClellan-McLean house here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. Hey, I am standing here near the corner of High and South Stratton, and we are looking at what is today Trinity United Church of Christ. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg, this was the German Reformed Church. And it was here in January of 1864 that Jenny Wade, after being disinterred from the garden of the Jenny Wade house, was brought to and buried in the German Reformed Church Cemetery. Now, you can see the original building here that was given a facelift later on. But as they extended the building, and where the parking lot area is, this was the site of the German Reformed Church Cemetery, and also, of course, the site of Jenny Wade's second burial spot. And she was most likely buried here because just on the other side of that building along Baltimore Street was her birth home. Over on Breckenridge Street was the home that she was living in during the battle. And over where you see the blue water tower in the distance was the the house of her sister, rather, Georgia and Louis McClellan, in which she was killed. So Jenny was from this area, and this was a church that she attended. So in January of 1864, she was taken from the Jenny Wade house and buried here today, where you see this building and parking lot. So somewhere around where we are walking was the burial place, or the second burial place, of Mary Virginia Wade. And of course, about a year and a half later, she was taken from here and buried in her third and final resting spot in Evergreen Cemetery. And we'll do a video there, but we wanted to continue on the legacy of Jenny Wade after death and where she was buried. This was her second burial spot here in January of 1864, in which was the German Reformed Church Cemetery. This has been the McClellan and McLean house and the story of Jenny Wade here on Gettysburg Historic Walking Tours. In November of 1865, Mary Virginia Wade was disinterred a second time and brought here to her final resting place in Evergreen Cemetery, just in the distance from the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse. About 35 years later, on August the 17th, 1900, this monument that depicts Jenny Wade was placed here at her gravesite. And then 10 years later, in 1910, this flag was erected next to her grave. That flag flies 24 hours a day, and she is only one of two women, the other being Betsy Ross, that has a flag fly at her gravesite 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This is the final resting spot of the only civilian killed during the Battle of Gettysburg, Mary Virginia Wade.
Above their heads, the Wade family kept their vigil, feeling that peculiar and unending grief all civilians must feel when war comes to their own front door. But the story does not end there. Wesley Culp, a native Gettysburg boy who had gone south before the war, had finally returned home with a message from a boyhood chum for his sweetheart in Gettysburg. Wesley Culp has returned to Gettysburg all right, but as a Confederate soldier fighting desperately at Culp's Hill, among the very fields that he had played upon as a boy, and the very hill that bore his family's name. The message he carried was from Jack Skelly, a playmate from his youth in Gettysburg, who is now a Union soldier lying mortally wounded in Virginia, a long way from home and loved ones. Wes's regiment had fought against Jack at Winchester just 18 days before. When Jack was wounded and captured, Wes found his boyhood friend and promised to deliver Jack's dying words to his sweetheart in Gettysburg. Wes was in Gettysburg now, fighting on his family's hill, just a few hundred yards from the girl to whom Jack's message was intended. Wes had tried unsuccessfully to deliver Jack's message on July 3rd, and as soon as this bothersome skirmishing for the family farm was over, he would try again. Wes was killed in the fighting on Culp's Hill. It did not matter, though, because in an example of the cruel irony that only war can bring, at that moment, Jack's Gettysburg maiden also lay dead in this very cellar. Her name was Jenny Wade.
Hi, this is Frank. We're here today at the birth house for Jenny Wade, and this is going to be the Jenny Wade birth house, part 1. Now, this house was built in the year 1820, and Jenny Wade was born on this house on May the 21st, 1843. She lived here for just about 1 year before moving to a second house on Breckenridge Street. And this house was here during the Battle of Gettysburg, and on July 1st, 1863, as Confederate troops chased the Union 1st and 11th Corps in through the town and down Baltimore Street, this area was occupied by Confederate troops. So this house was also a witness to the Battle of Gettysburg. And we're going to take a look inside the house in a few minutes. I do want to point out a few things on the outside of the house. And the first thing is this strange marker that's over here on the ground. It says 52M to B, and it sits here right in front of the Jenny Wade house. Now, what that marker is that marker is a mileage marker that was marked along the Baltimore Pike, which this road here, as you see up above, says Baltimore Street. That marker signified that this house stood exactly 52 miles from the center of Baltimore, and it's an early pre-Civil War marking on the mileage to Baltimore. As we walk to the front of the house here, there are 3 plaques. The first plaque designates this house as a Civil War building, meaning it was here in July of 1863 during the battle. The second plaque underneath specifies that the house was built in the year 1820. And then the third marker under it specifies that the heroine, Jenny Wade, who would be killed a few days later at her sister Georgia McClellan's house, was born in this house on May the 21st, 1843. Again, this has been the Jenny Wade birth house, part 1. Inside the Jenny Wade birth house, and this is going to be the Jenny Wade birth house, part 2. And we're in the room where Mary Virginia Wade was born on May the 21st, 1843, that we talked about outside in part 1. So this is the room that she was born in. And up here on the wall, ironically, are some photographs that relate to the Jenny Wade story. This is Mary Virginia Wade here. In the center is the president, Abraham Lincoln, 16th president of the United States. And next to him is Corporal Jack Skelly, who was rumored to be Jenny's boyfriend that she was corresponding with during the battle. Now, in the next room over here, this would have been the room where Jenny's parents stayed. As in that room, as well as this room, all the floorboards that you see down on the floor are original from the 1820 structure, which is in the front of the house. So again, this is the Jenny Wade bedroom that she was born in and the parents' bedroom. And this has been the Jenny Wade birth house, part 2. Jenny Wade birth house, part 3. We're in the parlor of the Jenny Wade birth house. Right in front of us is Baltimore Street. And this would have been the parlor for the front of the house here on July of 1863 as Confederate troops chased Union 1st and 11th Corps down Baltimore Street. The parlor room is the original room. However, the floorboards are modern, and that is because in 1970 there was a fire in a fireplace here in this room, and it destroyed a lot of the parlor and the original floors that you've seen upstairs in the Jenny Wade bedroom, which is above us. So the original floors, 1820 floors from the parlor, were burned around 1970. This has been the Jenny Wade birth house, part 3. Okay, this is going to be the Mary Virginia Wade residence house. In a previous video, we looked at the house where Mary Virginia Wade was born on May the 21st, 1843. And we did mention that she only lived there a short time before moving to Breckenridge Street. And this is Breckenridge Street here. The house that she lived in was just right around the corner up here. Now, Jenny's father, James Wade, was an embezzler. He wasn't very financially responsible. He wasn't a good parent. And Mrs. Wade and Mary Virginia Wade, that we know as Jenny, moved to this house. And this is the house that they were living in, their residence, during the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. And it was from this house here that Mary Virginia Wade left, most likely walked down Breckenridge Street, making a right onto Baltimore Street, and then heading south to her sister, Georgia McClellan. And Georgia McClellan had just had an infant baby. And Jenny was on her way to help her sister out with the care of her baby. And it was at that house on July 3rd, 1863, that Mary Virginia Wade was shot and killed, being the only civilian casualty during the Battle of Gettysburg. This is the second house of Mary Virginia Wade in Gettysburg. The first one is her birth house. This is her residence house that she lived in during the battle. And today it is located at 49 and 51 Breckenridge Street. The third house will be a house that we look at later that we know as the Jenny Wade house that has the statue of her out front, but it's actually the Georgia McClellan house. This has been the Mary Virginia Wade residence house